not to burp on the episode, huh?
Yeah, I'll try.
We're recording. We're recording.
I'll try. I'll try not to burp on the episode. All right. Episode 51, why trying to fix your team isn't working. There's been a noticeable shift in the conversations that we're hearing from leaders right now. More and more people are asking what it actually looks like to lead with emotional intelligence. Now, Dawn, you and I know this has been a hot topic phrase for years, right? Ever since that phrase was coined by Daniel Goleman years ago when he wrote his book called Emotional Intelligence. And there is now no doubt across any survey, across any data that's been collected, that the highest level leaders in the world would all agree that the core skills of emotional intelligence are considered like at the top of the pile in terms of critical, necessary, and effective in terms of great leadership.
Yep.
And so for all of our listeners, this conversation is radically relevant, hugely important, to the point where I would say every podcast episode that we've produced so far can fall under the banner of emotional intelligence. And I just want to say this really quickly, and forgive our listeners, forgive me. I've been battling a nasty virus and coming out on the other side, so I may be clearing my throat a little bit more than usual. But it's always important to remember that, like Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And as leaders, our temptation is to put a lot of time and attention on the strategies that we can employ to increase the productivity, engagement, collaboration, problem-solving capacity for ourselves, our teams, our organizations. We know those are essential. And yet what most people fail to consider is that only answers the what question. What are we going to do? It does not answer the deeper question of how are we going to do those things? Because you and I often say that the how we operate, perform, engage, conversate,
do those tasks that we're expected to do,
the how more often than not will undermine the what. And so emotional intelligence is like one of those buckets, categories, conversation pieces that is very relevant to what does it mean or look like to create a healthy culture. Culture is simply, this is how we do it. This is how we do, right? The prevailing attitudes and behaviors with which we perform our daily tasks and responsibilities. And so emotional intelligence features into how we create the kind of culture that becomes the engine that drives the way we operate so that we can achieve greater things.
Yeah.
And I would suggest this, that in every company, every team, every leader that I've ever worked with over the 20 plus years I've been doing this, the presenting issues and symptoms, pain points that people bring to us are always deeply rooted in the systemic or root system of how people operate. That's culture. And so what our temptation is we're throwing new strategies to try and solve problems that those strategies will never really solve.
That's right.
So what we need is to increase our ability to see, understand, diagnose, and transform culture so that we can actually achieve the long-term sustainable results that we're looking for. Is this making sense?
Yeah, it reminds me of something that we often talk about, which is we can choose incremental moves or we can choose exponential moves.
Love that.
When we are trying to tighten the systems and strategies and the tactical ways that we respond to situations, but we aren't dealing with the culture, we are always only going to make incremental moves. Whereas if we put that same amount of energy into dealing with what's going on in the root system, as you said, in what's going on in our culture, you're going to see exponential movement.
Yeah.
That's just the way that it works.
Which is why our clients love us, which is why they rave about us, because they've spent so much money on other coaches and consultants. And this is not to throw anybody else under the bus, but just to say, learning those incremental strategies.
Yeah.
When really what they're longing for are exponential strategies. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So getting back on track here, that was just a little aside that I thought was critical for our listeners to understand what's at stake here. It's really encouraging to see that, because emotional intelligence really is at the core of great leadership, this conversation matters. But where most people start with it is not actually where it begins. Right? So because if you pay attention to where frustration shows up in our leadership responsibilities, it almost always shows up in the context of engaging with others in relationship.
Absolutely.
Right? So something doesn't go the way we expected. Someone handles something differently than the way we would have. The conversation doesn't go quite right. Tensions arise. There's combativeness. There's argumentation, whatever. And you can feel it, right? There's like a reaction there internally for us. We call that getting triggered. And sometimes it's subtle, difficult to notice, and other times it's not. It's more obvious and apparent, right? We feel our blood pressure rise and our mind starts scrambling, and but here's the thing. It's not enough that you feel the urge to step in and deal with the presenting issue, because that experience is happening with someone else. And it's very easy to assume that the real issue at hand is what's sitting in front of you, the person, the circumstance, the situation, right? It must be something they did or didn't do or didn't understand. And so when we move to fix what's going on externally, right, we want to start there. We go back to them. We try to figure out what's wrong with them, where they went wrong, how they missed something so glaringly obvious, because from our perspectives, that's where the locus of the problem is. Mm-hmm. And to be fair, there's usually a piece of that that's true, right? It doesn't mean that people didn't respond poorly or people didn't drop the ball or miss a deadline, right? So we're not suggesting that people are without fault ever. But we as leaders, if we don't stop to consider in those moments what's going on internally for us, then we have a bigger problem. Because in a lot of these situations, what's happening externally is only a small part of why it feels the way it does. So when we're working with clients, we often present the picture of an iceberg, right? We often say that the reason the Titanic sank is not because there were icebergs in the water. They saw the icebergs, but because they didn't recognize that 90% of the mass of that iceberg was hidden beneath the surface of the water. In the same way, when we're presented with external challenges, our assumption is what we see in front of us is the whole of the problem.
That's right.
Not recognizing that 90% of our ability as leaders to engage what's happening externally is actually about what's going on internally for us.
That's so true. And it's funny. We all have the experience, or most often we can recognize this in people around us, because that's just easier for us as humans, where we see people who travel through their day having moments of frustration, getting triggered, feeling disappointed with the people on their team or the people in your household, right? Wondering, why do they continue to show up in these same annoying ways? Why do they continue to persist in these frustrating patterns of behavior? And our instinct every time, just like you said, is to blame them, put the locus of responsibility outside of ourselves. What do they need to do differently? What did they miss? How did they need to change? That's all. We are well practiced at those things. And yet the frustration persists when we feel like nothing ever changes, right? It feels like no matter how many times we point out to them that annoying behavior, no matter how many times we have the conversation about what needs to change, we still find ourselves in this triggered, heightened state. So I think the question that I'd love to dig into is, how do we as leaders, Eric, break out of this loop, right? Where we're constantly feeling triggered, trying to solve these problems externally. What do we need to do to get out of that kind of stuck place?
Oh yeah, that is the question, right? Because I think all of us, like for all of our listeners, if we kind of reflect on the different areas of our life, our relationship with our significant other, our kids, our team members, clients, whatever, we can all look at experiences where this loop is happening.
Yep.
Right, where we're constantly frustrated or triggered by something happening externally, then we try to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then oftentimes it almost seems to just make it worse.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And that's a problem, because over time what happens is we fatigue. Mm-hmm. And then we start to determine those are just bad people.
That's never going to change.
These are just bad clients. Nothing's ever going to change. So let me really quickly, Dawn, for our listeners, kind of just describe what this loop is for all of us, because it essentially is the same. Yep. We have an experience of whatever kind that we feel triggered by. In other words, somebody or something is not operating, behaving in the way that we expected.
Yep.
And so we feel triggered, right? Mentally, emotionally, and physically, we have an experience. And in those moments, most of us will default to kind of the fight or flight response. We call it moving into a villain or victim mindset. Mm-hmm. It's either poor me, nobody understands me, the world's not playing fair, nobody's out for my best interest, nobody sees me, or the villain, which is, oh, I'll show you, I'll control this, I'll manipulate this, I'll overpower, I'll dominate this situation, right? And for our listeners, you can reflect on which is probably more familiar for you, and different contexts might solicit a different response. But essentially what we're doing in those moments is we're playing the blame game. We're making people and circumstances responsible for how I am experiencing the world.
That's right. Yeah.
So we blame the world for what's going on. We're disrupted. And that only leaves us one option. This lower trajectory, we're kind of operating at a diminished kind of capacity of who we could be in our best moments. We end up on this villain or victim pathway that really just leads to us further compounding the problem, because here's the catch. When we are disrupted mentally, emotionally, and physically, when we're triggered, it becomes increasingly more difficult to bring sobriety, clear-mindedness, thoughtfulness, creativity to the problem at hand.
Right.
So when our temptation, our default response is to immediately try to fix what's going on outside of us, it's almost guaranteed that we're going to try and fix the problem. Because what we're not saying to our listeners is you should never have to deal with those issues. We do have to deal with the world around us. That's what leadership is about. Mm-hmm. But if we're entering into those problems without mental, emotional, or physical sobriety, right, to the degree that we are unsober,
yeah,
it increases the likelihood that we're going to bring a worse version of ourselves. We're going to bring anger, hostility, resentment, fear, insecurity, bitterness, whatever, to that situation. Mm-hmm. And so what we're really saying is that we have to recognize what's at stake in this. Otherwise, we're just going to keep operating out of that old default mindset. And I'm so passionate about this, Dawn, because when I first learned this a little over 20 years ago and began this journey that we're going to talk about called personal responsibility, I can't be responsible or in control of the world around me, but I can and am responsible to be in control of myself. Mm-hmm. That literally flipped my life upside down. Mm-hmm. And I went from seeing the world as happening to me to seeing the world as happening for me. My growth trajectory radically changed from a downward trajectory to an upward trajectory. Mm-hmm. And I began to operate increasingly more effectively with that shift. And so I really want to challenge our listeners to consider, have you made that shift yet? Not once in a while, but have you made a wholesale shift to tackle each day, recognizing that even the most difficult circumstances we experience are happening for us? That they're always an opportunity for us to learn about ourselves, to grow, to develop ourselves, to become a better version of ourselves, because that's what's at stake here.
Mm-hmm.
Not our ability to control our environment, but our ability to unlock more of the best version of ourselves.
And I would add that being able to, the desire to be able to control our environment is futile, actually.
Yeah.
Right. That's what we, we are pushing our energy in the entirely wrong direction, in something that we are never going to be able to do. We're never going to be able to control the geopolitical landscape, or what's happening in our culture, or what decisions our adult children are going to make, or how our team members are experiencing life, something happening, significantly in the life of our team. We can't control those things.
Yeah.
And yet we show up with the desire to control those things, thinking that's what's going to solve the problem. We find ourselves stuck in these patterns, and in fact we compound the problem.
Yep. So let's just dig a little bit deeper into this problem that we're addressing, right? This default response, or what we call reactivity. Mm-hmm. Right? Something feels off, and our instinct is to assume that the problem is external. And so we want to immediately go straight to that person or to the situation that we believe is disrupting us. And this is the easiest. This is the path of least resistance for us at the moment, right? In that moment, because it's what's right in front of us. And we play the blame game, and we put the locus of responsibility out there. We can see it. We can point to it. We can name it. And so that's where we tend to start. And we assume the source of the frustration is that external thing, right? And so we're asking, that must be what's causing this internal experience. That's what needs to change, right? It's the whole, John Mayer song, "Waiting on the World to Change,"
yeah,
right? So that we can feel better about ourselves, or we feel like we can operate more effectively. And I can just tell you literally thousands of stories where I've played that game in my marriage, with my kids as they've grown up, with team members, with clients, with friends, you name it. If the state of government in California just changed, then I could operate more effectively. Our business would grow more effectively. And again, it's not to say that there aren't problems externally. It's not to say that people don't have responsibility. It's just to say that our pathway of operating more effectively and having a better chance of solving those problems is not in the expectation for them to change. It's in redirecting that expectation that we are going to change, right? And so the issue is that, we're missing the picture for the most part, right? And it's also a place we don't have full control over, which is scary, right? So when we just move externally first, we're only working with part of what's actually happening, the iceberg. We're only dealing with the 10%, the presenting issue, rather than the 90%.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear about what this costs us, because it's easy to look at this and say, yeah, it's frustrating, it's costing us emotionally, yeah, it's taking more of our time, we're having to process this, or I feel like I'm carrying more weight in my team or my family than I should have to, and we assume that's the cost. But I want to be clear, that's not the actual cost. That's kind of like a tax.
Yeah.
But the real cost is that we don't solve the problem. We stay in the problem, and we likely compound the problem because we haven't done the work of asking what's going on inside. Like, yes, I'm experiencing this disruption. Why? Why, right? Like we say, asking why 7 times, peeling back the onion, so to speak. So let's shift here and talk about, how do we break out of this cycle? Where do we actually start if we want to change this experience that we're having, Eric?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me cast a little, as we jump into, let me cast a little vision for why do we want to do the work to break out of this cycle? Mm-hmm. At one level, there is what you just said, which is so that we are better positioned to operate as an asset rather than a liability, which means we have a better chance of helping to solve the problem because we'll be showing up to serve the situation rather than to control the situation. Yeah. Pardon me. But there's a deeper thing that I want us to know is available, which is this whole journey into personal responsibility is really a journey of unlocking our own maturation, our own clear-mindedness, our own sobriety, our own capacity, not just to solve one problem, but to solve 10,000 problems. Right? And the work that we do on ourselves is not a like, one for one. I do personal responsibility so I can solve one problem. Right. But actually, every time we go on this journey, even in the smallest moments of our life, like this, the minor triggers, somebody cuts us off in traffic and we feel disrupted and we start yelling at them, whatever. Right. And then we're just compounding the problem because now not only are they upset, we're upset, and then we go to work and then we probably spread that around. Yep. But taking this journey into personal responsibility actually is the process of cultivating a version of ourselves that we get to take into the future. So it's not a one for one. I practice personal responsibility, I solve one problem. It's actually, I practice personal responsibility, and that actually sets me up to solve the next 10 problems. Yeah. I practice it again, that sets me up to solve the next 50 problems. I practice it again, that sets me up to solve the next 1,000 problems. Right? Because every time we're cultivating this within ourselves, we're actually transforming so that we're now moving into the future as a better version of ourselves, which is really powerful. Right? This is exponential growth. This is compounding interest in the positive respect. Right? So rather than compounding the problem because we're in our reactive default patterns, the more often we cultivate personal responsibility, we actually become the entity in the room that is cultivating compounding interest in terms of the positive side, which is really awesome when we think about that, right? So, all right, the shift. We've got to make a shift if we're going to break out of this loop, right? So this is, we've already said it, the practice of personal responsibility, which begins with self-awareness. Yeah. Right? We like to talk about learning to pay attention to what's happening beneath the hood of the car. We're going through life, we're driving, through life, and things are happening. All of a sudden, the indicators on our dashboard are saying, hey, whoa, something's going on beneath the hood of the car. Well, I'm not a mechanic. I don't know exactly what those lights mean, right? But I'm glad they pop up so that I can know something's going on internally within the car that if I don't pay attention to, could lead to significant consequences. And that's how we live life. Totally ignoring the indicators until we find ourselves broken down on the side of the road in our relationships, in our work, in our health, in our finances, right? Is that metaphor carrying over?
Yeah. And I would add another layer to it. The way we typically respond is being like, oh, a light came on my dashboard. I'm going to take my car through the car wash. Right?
Yeah.
And then we're like, well, that probably solved it. Right? I'm solving something. I'm dealing with what's external, what I can see. Right? Never once cracking the hood to be like, oh, maybe it's something that's in here. And then we're completely shocked when we do end up on the side of the road because we're like, I took it through the car wash.
Yes.
What the heck?
Yep. So when we get triggered, when we're disrupted, right? In any of these moments, there are really two places that we can look. We can look at what's happening out there, or we can look at what's happening in here inside of us. And most of us are well-versed, practiced, and slightly experts at the first, right? At looking at what's going on out there and putting the locus of responsibility out there. But emotionally intelligent leadership recognizes that those indicators of disruption are an opportunity. Recognizing those indicators are pointing to something else that if we would pay attention to would give us a competitive advantage in all of these different kinds of experiences, right? And so it starts by asking, if I'm feeling disrupted, then I need to first and foremost pay attention to what's happening here. What's actually going on inside of me right now? How am I being mentally, emotionally, or physically disrupted? What are those actual experiences? What are the indicators that I'm being disrupted, right? And this isn't a way of avoiding what's happening externally, because we're going to have to probably come back to deal with that. But as a way of understanding what's shaping how we're interpreting the world around us.
Yep.
Right? Because we all know, we've all been guilty of having an experience, interpreting it poorly, reacting to that interpretation, and compounding the problem.
That's right.
Making it worse, right? And so because this determines if you will show up in that moment as an asset or liability, what we're really talking about is the process of recovering our mental, emotional, and physical sobriety so that we have a better chance of engaging whatever challenge we're facing with greater clarity, with greater composure, with greater confidence, with greater courage.
That's right. And this piece is where this shifts from theory into something really practical, right? How are we showing up in our homes with our teams, on the freeway, whatever? Because if I don't slow down long enough to look at what's happening inside of me and then ask that question, why? How do I interpret what I'm experiencing? I'm going to engage that situation, that person, with frustration, urgency, with that energy of like, I need to fix you, right? And that is always going to come out in how I lead. Even if I'm saying the right things, my energy, my tone, it's not coming from a place of mental and emotional sobriety. It's coming from a triggered, elevated place. And that's going to shape how that conversation actually lands. That's going to shape how, if I'm an asset or a liability in that moment.
Yeah, I love that. and I was writing some notes down because I want to come back to some stuff when we get to a certain point. When we start looking underneath the hood, we shift from how do I fix this situation, this person, this dynamic, to what is this bringing up for me right now?
Yeah.
Right? We have a saying in our world, you can only lead others to the degree that you can lead yourself. So self-leadership precedes leading others. And that's what we're talking about. Because if we're not paying attention to what's happening internally, and then it's, we talk about rose-colored lenses, right? We're going to be operating out of shit-colored lenses, right? We're going to be operating out of a distorted view of people, circumstances, or situations.
Yeah.
And which will inevitably mean we're going to respond poorly. And again, I can share thousands of stories where I have been wonderfully guilty of doing this exact thing. But I can also share thousands of stories over the last 20 plus years since I've learned this concept and put it into practice, where I've been able to, even after the fact, even when I'm stewing in my anger and frustration and resentment about some situation, when I finally am able to be like, you know what? Do I want to be stuck in this? Is this loop serving me? Is this the space I want to exist in?
Yeah.
And when I'm able to say, hell no, well, how do I break out of this loop? Right? And I'm able to practice personal responsibility. I'm able to practice self-awareness. I'm able to lead myself. It's unbelievable the way that creative solutions reveal themselves. It's unbelievable the way that people respond, even when I do move my energy externally. Once I've done the internal work and I move externally to deal with people or circumstances, it's amazing how much more effective I am, because now I'm operating in that space. We like to use the word as an asset
Mm-hmm.
But as somebody who's now available to serve the situation for what's in the best interest of all parties involved, rather than operating out of this kind of selfish, myopic, kind of self-preserving kind of default response.
I have another analogy came to mind while you were sharing that, like that tension of how do I break out of this? And for our female listeners, they will appreciate this. It to me, I was just sharing this with a client yesterday, that what often happens, it's like when you throw all your necklaces into the jewelry box and they get all tangled up, and that knot, you're like, this is I will never be able to unknot that knot, right? But what we try to do in this analogy is just yank on the ends of the chain, right? I'm going to yank on the ends of the chain and hope that that knot somehow loosens, and that never works. But what does work, Eric, I think you're muted, by the way, but what does work is that we start at the knot and just start slowly loosening a couple pieces, and suddenly the whole thing we can see it starts to unravel. And it's amazing how we do that in our lives, right? We're just gridlocked, and yet we have the power to start internally just loosening some of those strands just a little bit, and then we can see how the whole thing can become unmeshed, right?
I love that. I love that. So as we often do, we want to share from personal experience, because this is everyday life for us. So Don, why don't you start? Share with us in an experience, either personally or with a client, where you've navigated this.
Yeah, I actually just had this conversation with a client yesterday where we were talking, and she was confronted with having to be a self-aware leader. She realized that she had been operating in a space of the blame game. Why can't my team? Why don't they see? Why do they consistently, right? And some of her frustration was coming from this space of feeling like her team was consistently operating below her radical minimum standard, right? And so we just sat there. We sat in that space for a little bit, kind of processing what she was experiencing on her team, processing what I like to call the obviouslies, which are kind of those mental frameworks that we're operating out of, the lens through which we are looking at the situation. And what became very clear to her was that she was operating through the lens of being an owner, right? Being a business owner. She understands the time, energy, resources that each of these small decisions very practically make on her bank account. Yeah. And she was assuming that the rest of her team should be able to see through that very same lens.
Yeah.
And when we just sat there for a moment and unpacked that assumption, that lens through which she'd been looking at her team, and she was actually questioning whether her team, maybe I don't have the right people on my team. If they can't see these things that are so obvious to me, maybe they're not the right people on my team. And yet going back to self-awareness, actually going to what's happening underneath the hood here. How can you take some personal responsibility led her to the understanding of, oh yeah, I've been operating out of some expectations that are unreasonable for my team. They will never be able to look at my business through the lens that I look at my business.
That's right.
Because they're employees and I'm a business owner, which means I now have to take a certain level of responsibility for making some SOPs maybe, or casting vision for a few things around the office, connecting them to what I expect them to do, how I expect them to do it, right? Culture and operations. And then getting some clarity and agreement around those things. Like, yeah. She was totally humbled in that moment to say, man, yeah, I, this work of being a self-aware leader is no joke, because it demands that we constantly take the locus of responsibility and not absolve other people of their responsibility, but first to look at, how am I operating? What are my set of assumptions expectations, obviously's that I'm impugning on other people. What do I need? What do I need to shift? How do I lead myself in this situation before I can lead others? And yeah, it's hard work. It's hard work because all of our life experience for most of our clients, and I would say for ourselves too, until we're confronted with this, Eric, all of our experience is doing it the reverse.
Yeah.
How do I solve what's going on out there so that I can resolve this tension that I'm feeling in here?
Yeah. Well said. It reminds me of parenting in that we get frustrated with our kids at whatever stage of development they are. And more often than not, there are two things that are going on. Number one, we're projecting an expectation on them that is unrealistic. Why is my 7-year-old throwing a tantrum? Because they're 7 years old. Right. Why are they having a difficult time controlling their emotional, expression? Because they're 7 years old. That's one. We kind of project, like, why doesn't my 15-year-old know how to just sign up at the DMV to get their license and because they're 15, they probably need some help, right? So we project these unrealistic expectations, and then number two, we failed to reflect on what kind of environment have I as a parent created or contributed to that has set my children up for this kind of attitude, behavior, or engagement. And that is the challenge of leadership, to take responsibility for the fact that sometimes we're projecting on inappropriate expectations on our teams. And sometimes we have inadvertently created an environment, a culture, right? By our prevailing attitudes and behaviors, that is actually promoting the very things that we don't want.
Totally. Yeah. And that's usually because we're trying to solve a momentary discomfort in ourselves.
I love what you said at the end there, right? Like, we're really trying to control our environment so that we can resolve a tension that we feel internally. So in a similar way, I'll share, had been working with a client for some time, an executive who was complaining to me about an authority figure, right, in their organization. And we spent several sessions, this individual making a brilliant case for why their leader was not a great leader and why they justifiably were offended, upset, and resentful because they shouldn't be leading them. Right? Their leader was, quote unquote, unqualified to lead them. And I listened, and as we do, asked lots of questions and thought, wow, that's a tough situation, because there are cases in which, we are working with leaders who are being led by people who are highly dysfunctional, toxic, narcissistic, that kind of stuff, right? So it's not to say that's not possible, but I had an opportunity to travel out to this client, to their organization, because I work with the entire executive suite, and was able to spend a few days watching interactions unfold. And what I began to notice in this client was how often I watched them, when their leader would say or do something, react in ways that I thought, as an outside observer, like, whoa, that was really intense. That was combative. That was dismissive. That was disrespectful. That was dishonoring. So after the trip, we had a follow-up call, and I said, hey, I want to bring something to your attention. I'm not suggesting that you're all wrong in your perception of your leader, but let me observe for you what I saw and how I was interpreting what I saw. And I want you to help me understand, am I missing something? Am I getting this wrong? So I laid out what I saw. And I remember the client just sat on the other side of the Zoom call, just dead silent for like a minute. I could tell they were really deeply processing, right? Because it's easy for us to create an internal narrative of what we're experiencing.
Yeah.
Right.
That absolves us from any responsibility.
Until somebody steps in and says, well, but I watched this situation. So let me mirror back to you what I watched. And they very timidly said, I hear what you're saying. I think I can see what you're saying. And I need to give it some thought. I said, hey, take a week or two. And here's what I want you to do. I'm bringing to your attention what I saw. I'm sharing with you how I interpreted your response. I felt like it seemed you were highly reactive, combative, defensive, self-protecting. It seemed like you were protecting your territory within the organization. And you seemed dishonoring in the way you spoke to your leader in a group setting. You seemed dismissive of their authority in certain situations.
Yeah.
And I said, I could be wrong, but that's what I saw. That's my take on it. I just want you to give it a thought. And I want you to think not just about what I'm sharing with you, but can you imagine how this might be happening in other situations as well? Mm-hmm. We come back a week or two later, get on the call, and they just said, Eric, I am so embarrassed to say that I think you're absolutely right. I said, well, okay, let's unpack that, because I don't need to be right. I want to know, what have you resonated? What have you connected with, right? And because our job as coaches is not to impose these things on people, but to help them ask questions and reflect and begin the process of practicing some self-awareness that will, highlight some things about what's going on in them so that they can take personal responsibility. And by the end of the call, they were practicing personal responsibility, saying, gosh, I can see where I do this, not just in the workplace with my boss, but in my marriage, with my kids, with, on and on. It was just this wonderfully powerful moment. And I remember saying to this individual, I said, listen, the way you've been operating, because this individual is a high performer, high capacity, highly productive, mm-hmm. right? I mean, they're just off the charts in terms of their abilities. But I said this, you have justified how you operate based on what you think is right. And I'm not even disagreeing with you about what's right and wrong, but how you show up is radically undermining anything you're trying to say. The how is undermining the what. And I said, so you have these superpowers, like our abilities, our skills, our talents, our experience, our expertise. These are superpowers. I said, I said this is such a stupid analogy, but it makes sense. I said, so if I'm hanging out with Superman, mm-hmm. and I say, Superman, I've got this knot in my shoulder, and could you just give me a little, rub it out a little bit, massage it. Like, can you get rid of that thing in my shoulder blade? And he pushes into my shoulder and pokes a hole through my body because he has that kind of superpower. It's not the what he was trying to do, it's how he did it that compounded the problem.
Yeah.
Now I have a greater injury.
Yes.
Right. And so I said, you're operating with these superpowers, but how you are operating with those superpowers is compounding problems, breaking trust, and undermining your future success. I said, what's at stake here is not just your relationship with your boss. It's actually your ability to unlock more of who you are and more of the asset that you can be to that team and that organization. Right. More of your fulfillment. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that serves as a great springboard into, some practical points of application. Like, how do we begin to practice this? So let me just offer a few quick little handles, and then we'll wrap this up. So for all of us, these are the basic steps to breaking the loop, the cycle of default reactivity. Mm-hmm. Number one, learn to pay attention to the indicators on the dashboard of your life that you're being triggered, upset, disrupted. Learn to pay attention to the indicators that you are mentally, emotionally, or physically being disrupted. Got to learn to pay attention to this because they're slightly different for everybody. right? And a great way to do this is to reflect on past incidences where you knew you were disrupted. What happened to you?
Yep.
How did you react? How did you behave? How were other people impacted? If you really want to take this to the next level and practice deeper self-awareness, ask your significant other, your adult kids, your team members, your friends, hey, when I am disrupted, how do you experience me? What comes out of me? Do I raise my voice? Do I withdraw? Do I become petty? Do I become overly sarcastic? Do I become overpowering? Whatever. Learn to pay attention to those indicators. Number 2, practice personal responsibility, which is simply this: accepting that we cannot control the world around us, and the world is not the locus of responsibility for our attitudes and our behaviors.
Yes.
The locus of responsibility for our attitudes and behaviors is in one place only, and that is inside of us. So personal responsibility begins with, how am I operating? What are my attitudes and behaviors? And how is that impacting my environment for better and for worse? That's personal responsibility, right? Regardless of how everybody else is operating. Number 3, self-awareness. Why am I so triggered? Why am I so upset? Why am I angry? Why am I frustrated? Why am I feeling insecure? Why am I feeling resentful? Why am I feeling bitter? Why? Really do some work. Why am I so disrupted? Why is this upsetting? Why did I fly off the handle? Why did I lose my temper? Why did I shout and scream? Why did I try to run somebody off the road? Why? What's going on for me? Right? Just understanding that a little bit deeper. And then here's the simple thing, simply asking this question. This is the $1 billion question. How does the best version of me respond to this situation? We've posed that question so many times in these podcast episodes because that is the question. And that's a part of how we disrupt these old patterns. Say, well, how does the best version of me? And when we ask that question, number 1, we assume there is a better version of me. And there is, I promise, for every one of us. Number 2, it gives us a chance to paint a picture of who we actually want to be and can be. And that sets us up to say, okay, that's how I want to behave. That's how I want to show up. That's how I want to respond to this email, this text, this conversation. Just giving ourselves permission when we're disrupted to pause and just walk through these simple steps. In the beginning, it feels a little bit more difficult, like any new skill. Yep. It's like, oh gosh, this feels mechanical and it takes some time. Yeah, it does. This is why we're such big proponents of journaling. Because oftentimes in the beginning, in the moment, you're flustered. So what I'll do at the end of a day, oftentimes, or I get to a point in my week where I have some time to reflect, I'll just sit and go, what were the moments in the week where I was most disrupted? And now let me reflect on that moment and let me walk through these steps, because even walking through these steps after the fact sets me up to re-engage those people or those circumstances far more effectively. And guess what? That's also how we cultivate this better version of ourselves that we actually get to take into future situations.
That's right. Yeah. And I just want to point out to our dear listeners that if you are ever being coached by Eric and he says, I want to bring something to your attention, nothing that comes out of his mouth next will you enjoy or like.
But I'm very sweet in how I always say, hey, can I bring something? Can I share something? I'm curious if this might resonate with you, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about us imposing anything, but part of our job as coaches is to, like a mirror, to reflect back to people how they're operating and how they're impacting their environment. And I say to leaders all the time, you cannot practice self-awareness in a vacuum.
Yeah,
we can only practice self-awareness by soliciting or getting the feedback that we need to help us better see how we are impacting the other people.
That's right. All right. Well, like we do in every episode, we want to pause and have a takeaway moment because, as I always say, inspiration without action is crap. So you can listen to every podcast, read every book, and unless you actually pull a nugget that you are going to implement, what is it actually changing for you? Yeah. So we actually take a few moments in the episode where we're just silent and we give you a moment to consider all of the things that we talked about brought to your attention in this episode. What's the one thing that you need to sit with, or what's one action that you need to take as a result of this information? So we'll be quiet. Wherever you are, take a moment and consider that.
Much love to our faithful listeners. If you're new to this podcast, we're so grateful that you spent some time with us. Our ambition is to serve you by sharing with you all of the things that have radically transformed our lives, our leadership at every level, and across every space. And we hope it does the same for you. You can always find so much more at our website and through our online resources, practical, simple, transferable tools that will literally change and elevate, upgrade the way that you show up as a human being. Today, we talked about how this is where emotionally intelligent leadership really begins. Not with trying to first manage everything happening around us, but with learning how to recognize what's happening inside of us, especially when things feel off or we're disrupted.
Yeah. And if this is a conversation that you want to continue to have, we have monthly masterclasses where we dig into these topics and others like it in a much more one to many. Josh, you're gonna have to edit that out. I had a brain fart, so
don't edit that. Just leave it in. Keep going.
No, Josh,
I want people to see the real Dawn. She's not as cool and calm and collected as she appears to be. She makes
Eric's just trying to get back at me for making fun of the way he said wolf the other day. So, anyways, Josh, we're gonna pick it back up. If you'd like to continue this conversation, we have monthly masterclasses where we dig into topics like this and others that, as Eric said, are going to help you upgrade your life and your leadership. You can sign up for those at mpwrcoaching.com/masterclass. We'd love to see you there. Why are you being a turd?
We've already screwed up the whole ending, Don. Thanks. We had a perfect podcast until that moment. All right. To all of our wonderful listeners, join us for our next episode where we are going to answer and respond and process and reflect and share lots of good stuff as it relates to the questions that clients feel are most persistent, relevant, and critical in their leadership experience about emotional intelligence and how developing emotional intelligence can radically transform our personal, team, and organizational culture. Until next time.